The sound of a deadbolt sliding into place is supposed to mean safety, but for Lila, it was the start of a countdown. She just wanted to keep the $50 bill taped to Sarah's photo, find a city where no one knew her name, and finally stop looking over her shoulder. Choosing the abandoned penthouse as a hiding spot was her first mistake. Choosing the space under the bed of a Vori kingpin was her second. Now, the man she was running from is the least of her problems. Dust motes danced in the silver moonlight, slicing through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Volkov penthouse. Pressed against the freezing hardwood, Lila Voss held her breath until her lungs burned, her hand clamped so tightly over her mouth that her fingernails left crescents in her skin. Just an hour ago, she was Lila from apartment 4B, a forensic accountant who had just flagged a $3 million wire transfer signed in Julian's handwriting. In the silent, cavernous room above her, the air changed, heavy with the scent of expensive tobacco. She was used to being a ghost in the machine of corporate fraud, a woman who survived by being overlooked. But as a pair of hand-stitched Italian leather boots came to a halt inches from her face, Lila realized that in the world of Adrian Volkov, there are no ghosts, only prey that hasn't been caught yet. The rain had been a wall of gray ice, blurring the neon signs of the city into bleeding smears of light. Lila's lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass as she ducked into the service alley of the Volkov Tower. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could still feel the phantom weight of Julian's hand on her shoulder, a pressure that had followed her across 3 zip codes and 2 state lines. Her fingers, numb and white-knuckled, fumbled with the crinkled photo in her pocket. It was Sarah's graduation day. In the picture, her sister was laughing, her mortarboard tilted at a silly angle. Lila remembered the exact moment she had taped the emergency $50 bill behind the frame. It was a Tuesday. She had been making pasta, and the sun was hitting the linoleum of apartment 4B just right. Back then, emergency meant a flat tire or a late utility bill. It didn't mean becoming a ghost to stay alive. Now the money was gone, spent on a bus ticket that didn't go far enough, and Sarah was just a memory printed on glossy paper. The lock on the penthouse service door had been surprisingly easy. Lila had spent years auditing the digital footprints of people who thought they were clever. Physical security followed the same patterns. People were lazy where they felt safe. She had expected the penthouse to be empty, a silent monument of marble and glass. Instead, the air was warm. It smelled of cedar and something sharp, like a storm about to break. When the heavy front doors groaned open, and the rhythm of those leather boots began to pace the floor, Lila didn't think. She reacted. She slid under the heavy mahogany bed frame, pressing her spine against the floorboards. The wood was cold, smelling faintly of lemon wax. She watched the dust motes settle through the moonlight. Then the footsteps stopped. A heavy silence filled the room, the kind that happens right before a predator strikes. The tobacco smoke drifted lower, curling into the dark space where she lay. Lila stared at the boots. They weren't moving. They weren't searching. They were waiting. Then the bed shifted. The weight of a man sitting down sent a low creak through the frame, pinning her closer to the floor. Lila's heart hammered against the wood, a frantic, rhythmic thud. "You can stop holding your breath, Lila," a voice said. It wasn't loud. It was a calm, low vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards themselves. "Julian is still 3 blocks away, staring at the wrong service entrance. But you're exactly where I expected you to be." Lila froze. He didn't just know she was there. He knew her name, and he was watching her pursuer in real time. The sanctuary she thought she had found was just a smaller, more elegant cage. Lila didn't move. She didn't even blink. The man on the bed remained still, his weight a steady pressure above her. The only sound in the room was the soft tick of a clock and the distant, muffled siren of a city that didn't know she was dying. "Get out," the voice said. It wasn't an order, it was an invitation. Lila slid out from under the bed, her joints stiff and aching. She stood slowly, keeping her back to the glass. Adrian Volkov was younger than the rumors suggested, with sharp, clean features that looked like they had been carved from the same marble as the fireplace. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a businessman who had just finished a long day of work. He held a glass of water toward her. Lila didn't take it. She looked at the door, then back at him. "How do you know my name?" "I own the firm you audited last year, Lila. I also own the building Julian is currently circling." Adrian stood up. He was a head taller than her, but he didn't lean in. He gave her space, which felt more dangerous than if he had cornered her. "Julian doesn't want you back because he loves you. He wants you because you saw the ledger he kept under the floorboards of apartment 4B. You know he's been stealing from people more dangerous than himself." Lila's hand went to her pocket, her fingers brushing the edge of the photo. She had thought she was running from a man. She realized now she was running from a paper trail. Adrian walked to the window, looking down at the street. "The front door is unlocked. You can leave right now. Julian is waiting by the black sedan. He has a silencer and a very long memory. If you walk out, you'll be gone before the sun comes up." Lila looked at her boots, stained with the mud of the alleyway. "And the other choice?" "I have a different kind of ledger," Adrian said, turning to face her. His eyes were the color of a winter sea, deep, cold, and impossible to read. "Someone is moving $5 million out of my accounts every month. They are using the same encryption patterns you flagged in Julian's files. I need a ghost to find a ghost." He set a laptop on the desk. The screen was dark, reflecting the moonlight. "You stay here, and Julian never sees you again. You find my money, and I give you a new name, a new life, and a bank account that actually belongs to you." Lila looked at the laptop, then at the heavy oak door. Outside, the world was a hunt. Inside, it was a trade. She walked toward the desk, her footsteps silent on the rug. She didn't look at the door again. She sat down and opened the laptop. "I'll need the server logs from the last quarter," she said, her voice finally steady. Adrian watched her, a small, grim smile touching his lips. "They're already waiting for you." The Volkov estate did not feel like a home. It felt like a museum where the exhibits were still breathing. Lila was given a room on the third floor with silk sheets and a window that looked out over the city she used to live in. Every morning, a silent woman in a gray uniform left a tray of tea and toast by the door. Every afternoon, Lila sat in the wood-paneled library, staring at the blue light of the laptop Adrian had provided. On the surface, she was a guest, but when she tried to walk toward the gardens, a man in a sharp black suit would appear from the shadows. He wouldn't say no. He would simply step into her path and check his watch, a silent reminder that her freedom was tied to the numbers on her screen. Lila spent her days tracing a series of shell companies that led to nowhere. The thief was clever. They moved money in small, uneven amounts that looked like rounding errors. But Lila noticed something the security team had missed. The transfers only happened on Tuesdays, the same day the estate's external servers did their weekly backup. By the third night, the silence of the house began to feel heavy. Adrian was away on business, leaving the halls smelling of cold stone and wax. Lila didn't go to sleep. Instead, she left her room, her bare feet making no sound on the thick rugs. She made her way back to the library, but she didn't open her laptop. She sat at the main terminal, the one the head of security, a man named Victor, used during the day. She knew the guards relied on a guest-level firewall to keep her contained. They saw her as a girl who was good with math, not a woman who had spent years hiding her own life from the government. Her fingers moved across the keys with a steady, quiet rhythm. She didn't look for the money this time. She looked for the gate. Within 10 minutes, she found the partition for the internal security cards. She pulled a small, blank magnetic strip from her pocket, the one she had taken from the back of the graduation photo, and slid it into the side reader. The screen flickered. A progress bar crawled across the glass. 80%. 90%. Complete. Lila pulled the card out and tucked it into the waistband of her leggings. She now had a digital copy of Victor's master key. As she turned to leave, she noticed a single physical file left on the edge of the desk. It was a list of names with red lines through them. Her breath hitched when she saw Sarah Voss at the bottom of the page. There was no red line through Sarah's name. Instead, there was a small, handwritten note in the margin. Location confirmed. Pending instruction. Lila's heart went cold. Adrian hadn't just saved her. He was holding the one thing she had left in the world over her head. She realized then that the cage wasn't just made of silk and stone. It was built out of everything she loved. The digital master key felt like a cold coin against Lila's skin as she sat before the monitors the next morning. The library was silent, save for the low hum of the cooling fans. Adrian had not returned, but his presence was everywhere, in the scent of the leather chairs and the way the guards outside her door stood a little straighter whenever his name was mentioned. Lila's eyes darted across the grid of security feeds. She was supposed to be looking for financial discrepancies, but her mind kept drifting to the file she had seen. Sarah. Location confirmed. She had to know how much Adrian was hiding from her. She used her new access to pull up the external gate cameras from the previous night. She scrolled through hours of grainy, gray footage of rain hitting the pavement. Then at 2:14 a.m., a black sedan pulled into the delivery bay. Lila froze. The man who stepped out of the car wasn't wearing a Volkov uniform. He wore a heavy wool coat she recognized. He walked with a slight limp in his left leg, a detail she had noticed 1,000 times while hiding in the closet of apartment 4B. It was Julian. He wasn't being chased, and he wasn't sneaking. He walked toward the side entrance of the estate with a calm, familiar stride. A moment later, one of Adrian's lieutenants, a man named Merrick, stepped into the frame. They didn't fight. They didn't even argue. Merrick handed Julian a small, padded envelope, and Julian nodded, checking the contents before sliding it into his pocket. Lila's breath hitched. The man who was supposed to be her protector was trading envelopes with her predator in the middle of the night. She leaned closer to the screen, watching Julian's face. In the dim light of the security lamp, he looked exactly the same, sharp, impatient, and hungry. For months, she had thought of herself as a victim running for her life. But as she watched Julian laugh at something Merrick said, a new sensation settled in her chest. It wasn't the cold prickle of fear. It was a hard, hot spark of clarity. She realized then that she wasn't just a guest or a captive. She was a witness. Lila closed the security feed and opened the financial ledger again. She didn't look for the ghost transfers this time. She looked for Marek's payroll ID. If Julian was getting paid, there was a trail. And if Adrian was allowing it, she would find out why. She reached into her pocket and touched the corner of Sarah's photo. She wasn't just working to survive anymore. She was going to wait for the right moment to burn the whole system down. She began to type, her fingers hitting the keys with a new, dangerous rhythm. She would find the money, but she wouldn't give it back to Adrian. She would use it to buy her way out of both their lives. The car ride to the city's industrial district was silent. Adrian sat in the back seat with Lila, his profile sharp against the passing streetlights. He hadn't mentioned Julian. He hadn't mentioned the file on the desk. He simply handed Lila a silk wrap to cover her shoulders and told her to watch the hands of every man at the table. The game was held in the basement of a converted warehouse. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and old dust. For men sat around a green felt table under a single hanging light. These were Adrian's captains, the men who kept his empire running. "This is Lila," Adrian said, his voice smooth as silk. He didn't introduce her as an accountant or a guest. He didn't introduce her at all. He simply pulled out a chair for her slightly behind his own, placing her in the shadows. Lila watched. She didn't look at the cards. She looked at the way Merrick, the man from the security feed, kept tapping his wedding ring against the mahogany table. She noticed how another man, Petrov, bit the inside of his cheek every time he raised a bet. They were all powerful, dangerous men, but they all shared one thing. They wouldn't look Lila in the eye. To them, she was a ghost that Adrian had brought into the inner circle. She was the woman who had survived Julian, and that made her a wild card they didn't know how to play. Halfway through the night, a man named Ivan joined the table. He was loud and moved with a forced confidence. But when Adrian casually mentioned the missing $5 million, Ivan's hand faltered. He didn't tremble, and he didn't look away. Instead, he looked directly at Lila. In that second, Lila saw it. It wasn't the fear of a man being caught by his boss. It was the specific, sharp terror of a man who realized the woman in the shadows could see through his skin. Ivan wasn't afraid of Adrian's gun. He was afraid of Lila's mind. He looked back at his cards, but the rhythm of his breathing had changed. He began to play too fast, trying to end the game, trying to escape the room. Lila leaned forward, her lips inches from Adrian's ear. The movement was small, but the entire table went still. "The money isn't being moved through offshore accounts anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. "He's using the physical shipping manifests at the docks. Ivan is the one signing the overrides." Adrian didn't move. He didn't even look at Ivan. He simply placed a high bet and leaned back. "Is that so?" "He's not just stealing for himself," Lila added, her eyes locked on Ivan's sweating forehead. "He's paying Julian to keep the routes clear." Adrian finally turned his head. His eyes met Lila's in the dark. For the first time, she didn't see a captor or a boss. She saw a partner who was just as cold as she was. He reached out and covered her hand with his, a gesture that felt like a promise and a threat all at once. The hunt was no longer a secret. It was a race. The return from the warehouse felt like a fever dream. Lila retreated to her room, her hand still tingling from where Adrian had touched it. She closed her heavy oak door and turned the lock, the click echoing in the hollow silence. But as she turned toward the bed, the air in the room felt wrong. Resting on her white pillow was a single red rose. Its petals were so dark they looked like bruised skin, and the thorns were long and sharp. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Julian used to leave the same flowers on her desk at apartment, Forby whenever he wanted her to know he had been watching her while she slept. Lila stood perfectly still. She didn't scream, and she didn't call for the guards. Instead, she walked to the rose and picked it up by the stem. A small drop of blood beaded on her thumb where a thorn pierced her skin. She looked at the red drop, then at the locked window. The room was supposed to be a fortress, but Julian had walked right through the walls. She didn't let the fear settle. She sat at her small desk and pulled out the master keycard she had cloned. Within minutes, she was deep inside the estate's maintenance logs. Her eyes moved fast, scanning the timestamps for the garden gate and the service elevator. She found the gap at 9 p.m., exactly when Adrian had been introducing her to the captains. The garden gate had been opened with a manual override code. She cross-referenced the code's ID with the financial overrides she had discovered during the card game. The numbers matched perfectly. It wasn't Julian who had entered the house. It was Ivan. The captain hadn't just been skimming money. He was Julian's delivery boy. He had used the rose to try and break her spirit, hoping she would be too scared to keep digging into the shipping manifests. Lila leaned back in her chair, the blue light of the screen reflecting in her wide, calm eyes. She realized that Ivan and Julian weren't just partners, they were desperate. They were trying to scare her because they knew she was winning. She picked up her phone and sent a single message to the private server Adrian monitored. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a screenshot of the maintenance log side by side with Ivan's signature. "Ivan didn't just take the money," she wrote. "He took the keys." She looked back at the rose. With a steady hand, she crushed the petals in her palm until they were nothing but a red stain. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was the one holding the evidence, and for the first time, the predator was the one who should be afraid of the dark. The grand ballroom of the Volkov estate was a sea of moving silk and gold. Hundreds of guests drifted across the floor, their faces hidden behind masks of porcelain, lace, and velvet. In this room, everyone was a stranger, and every smile was a lie. Adrian stood at the top of the marble staircase, his black mask making his eyes look like chips of ice. Lila stood beside him, dressed in a gown of midnight blue that felt like a second skin. Her heart was a steady drum in her ears. She knew the plan. Tonight, Ivan and Julian wouldn't be looking for a forensic accountant. They would be looking for Adrian. Before they descended into the crowd, Adrian turned to her. He didn't offer a word of encouragement or a warning. Instead, he reached out and adjusted the delicate silk mask over her eyes. His touch was slow, deliberate, and entirely too long for a simple gesture. His thumb lingered for a heartbeat against the curve of her cheek, a warm pressure that felt like a brand. In the middle of the crowded hall, the gesture was a silent, public claim. He wasn't just protecting her, he was telling the room, and the enemies watching from the corners, that she was untouchable. "Stay in the light until I move," he murmured. Then, he let his hand drop and stepped away, disappearing into the swirl of guests. Lila didn't wait. She moved toward the edge of the room, blending into the shadows near the velvet curtains. To the wealthy donors and captains, she was just another beautiful face, easily ignored. She used the master key card hidden in her palm to slip through a narrow service door that led to the kitchen corridors. The air here was different, colder, smelling of damp stone and bleach. She checked the tablet she had hidden behind a stack of silver trays. The security feeds showed 3 heat signatures moving through the basement ventilation shafts, headed toward the ballroom's chandelier winches. They weren't coming for Adrian from the floor. They were coming from above. Lila navigated the narrow halls with the memory of a ghost. She reached the winch room just as the first hitman stepped out of the shadows. He was dressed as a waiter, but he held a ceramic blade that wouldn't set off a metal detector. She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for the control panel. With a quick sequence of keystrokes, she locked the winch gears and flooded the room with fire suppression foam. The hitman slipped, the white mist blinding him. Lila stood in the doorway, watching him struggle. She realized then that she wasn't just stopping a hit. She was dismantling Julian's last chance. She turned and locked the service door from the outside. One down. But as she checked the feed again, she saw a second signature already standing on the balcony, directly behind where Adrian was supposed to be. The trap was moving faster than she was. The elevator climbed in silence, the numbers glowing like small, dying stars. Lila didn't go to the ballroom. She went to the roof. She knew Julian's patterns better than he knew his own. He wouldn't stay to fight Adrian's men. He would go back to the place where he first lost her, looking for the leverage he thought he still held. The penthouse was exactly as she had left it, bathed in silver moonlight and smelling of cold cedar. The service door creaked as she entered. A second later, a shadow detached itself from the heavy velvet curtains. "I knew you couldn't stay away from the dark, Lila," Julian said. He stepped into the light, his limp more pronounced now, his face twisted into a sharp, jagged smile. He held the black sedan's keys in one hand and a heavy revolver in the other. "Adrian is busy with his little war downstairs. We're leaving." Lila didn't flinch. She stood by the bed, the very place where her life had changed. "You aren't leaving, Julian. You haven't been in charge since the moment you stepped into this building." She reached into her gown and pressed a button on the small remote she had rigged to the room's smart grid. Suddenly, the heavy electromagnetic locks on the penthouse doors engaged with a loud, metallic thud. The windows didn't just lock, they reinforced with steel shutters. Julian's smile vanished. He lunged toward her, but Lila didn't run. She dropped low, sliding into the narrow architectural gap between the master closet and the reinforced wall. The same loophole, she had mapped out during her first week of hiding. Julian slammed into the solid wood, his gun hand trapped in the closing motorized door of the closet. The heavy front doors opened. Adrian walked in, his tuxedo jacket gone, his white shirt sleeves rolled up. He wasn't breathing hard. He looked at Julian, who was pinned and swearing. Then he looked at Lila as she stepped out of the shadows. Adrian didn't move to help Julian, nor did he move to strike him. Instead, he reached into his waistband and pulled out a small, sleek pistol. He walked over to Lila and placed the weapon in her hand. The metal was warm from his body. "He's the reason you spent your life under floorboards, Lila," Adrian said softly, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "The choice is yours. You can be the woman who hides or the woman who finishes the audit." Lila looked at Julian. He looked small now, a loud, angry man trapped in a room that didn't belong to him. She realized she didn't feel the old, suffocating fear. She felt nothing at all. She raised the weapon, her gaze steady on the man who had stolen her sister and her safety. "The ledger is closed, Julian," she said. She didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she handed the gun back to Adrian and looked him in the eye. "Killing him is too easy. I want him to watch while I take everything he ever stole." Adrian's expression shifted, not into a smile, but into something deeper. "Respect." He signaled to the guards in the hall. "Take him to the basement. Tell the police we found the man responsible for the shipping fraud." Lila walked to the window and watched the shutters rise, revealing the city below. She had made her choice. She wasn't running anymore. The morning sun over the city was no longer a threat. It was an asset. 6 months had passed since the night the penthouse was locked tight, and the world outside the Volkov estate had changed. Julian was no longer a shadow in the rain. He was a name on a legal transcript, serving a life sentence for the very fraud Lila had uncovered. Adrian's empire had shifted too. The shipping manifests were clean, the ghost accounts were closed, and the business was now a wall of legitimate steel and glass that no one dared to touch. Lila stood in the center of the master bedroom, her silk robe trailing on the floor. She watched a new maid, a young woman who couldn't have been older than 20, kneeling by the side of the heavy mahogany bed. The girl was trembling. Her hands shook as she used a soft cloth to scrub the floorboards, her eyes fixed strictly on the wood. She looked exactly like someone who was trying to be invisible. Lila looked down at the dark, narrow space beneath the bed frame. It was the same gap where she had once pressed her face against the floor, praying for her heartbeat to stop. She realized with a strange, cold clarity that she could never fit there again. It wasn't just that she was safe, it was that her spirit had grown too large for the shadows. She had spent her life learning how to hide, but Adrian had taught her something more dangerous: how to be the person who watches. The maid accidentally clattered her bucket against the bedpost. She gasped, a small sound of pure panic, and looked up. For a second, her eyes met Lila's. The girl didn't see a victim or a guest. She saw the woman who had dismantled a captain and a predator in a single night. She saw the person who held the keys to the city. The maid quickly bowed her head, her shoulders hunching in instinctive, terrified respect. She didn't look back up until Lila turned away. Adrian appeared in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the hall. He didn't speak. He simply held out a folder, the morning's global audits. Lila took it from him, her fingers brushing his in a way that was now familiar and steady. "The new accounts in London are flagged," she said, her voice calm and absolute. "I'll have the source of the leak by noon." Adrian nodded, a look of quiet pride in his eyes. He didn't need to protect her anymore. He just had to stay out of her way. Lila walked toward the balcony, the file in her hand. She wasn't the girl hiding under the bed anymore. She was the reason people were afraid to look under it. The audit was finished, and for the first time in her life, the balance was exactly where she wanted it to be.